A lot of wrestlers have passed through the halls of WWE over the years. Hell, at some point, almost every big name has made their way there, even if just for a short spell. But not every one of those performers was used as well as they should have been. No, while some like Cody Rhodes, The Rock, or John Cena have all met their full potential in WWE, there are other great talents who ended up getting botched spectacularly while there. But who are the biggest examples of this? Well, that's exactly what we're going to be looking at right now, starting with Vader. Yes, in the long history of professional wrestling, Vader might just be the best big man to ever lace up a pair of boots. Come on now, this guy was an absolute phenomenon in that he looked like a crazed bear which had just been let out of his cage, all while he moved like a man half his size. So great was he, in fact, pretty much everywhere he went, he'd become a huge star. Whether this be in WCW, where he became a 3-time World Heavyweight Champion, New Japan Pro Wrestling, where he became a 3-time IWGP Heavyweight Champion, or All Japan Pro Wrestling, where he became a 2-time Triple Crown Heavyweight Champion. The only place he didn't succeed, in fact, was in WWF. Why was this? Well, it wasn't for a lack of trying, at least not initially. No, when Leon White was first brought into WWF in 1996, it felt like Vince McMahon was going to go all the way with him. Hell, that's exactly why on the first night in the territory, he absolutely destroyed then on-screen WWF president Gorilla Monsoon. Unfortunately though, this would end up being the peak of Vader's run in WWF, as not long after that, he'd be put into a feud with Shawn Michaels, and this was where the problem started. That's right, rather than win the WWF title here, as was the initial plan, Vader would end up being yet another victim of the Clique's infamous politicking. And once that happened, he was never able to recover. No, even after he moved on from HBK, by now it seemed very much like Vince McMahon had lost interest in the Mastodon. So it was then that we got a situation where, rather than being a final boss heel as he'd been everywhere else, Leon White would end up spending the rest of his WWF run playing the role of an upper mid-carder who, more often than not, did jobs to more push talent. And that represents a huge waste, as there was so much potential to be found in pushing the big man to the moon in WWE. But alas, this is just not the way things went for Vader. And it's also not the way things would go for our next subject when he briefly joined the WWF during the late 80s and early 90s, the man known to wrestling fans everywhere as Dusty Rhodes. Yes, we don't need to tell any of you who Dusty Rhodes is, that's for sure. After all, back during the 70s and 80s, he was one of the biggest babyfaces in the entire industry, helping to rocket Jim Crockett Promotions towards huge levels of success. Come 1989, however, the relationship the American Dream had with JCP, now known as WCW, was a lot frostier. And this is what led to him doing the seemingly impossible by making the jump over to WWE. Yes, before Cody Rhodes was shocking the wrestling world by jumping across enemy lines, his father was doing the same thing. Sadly though, Dusty's run in WWE would not go anywhere near as well as his son's. And the reason for this can be summed up with one word: polka dots. That gear covered in yellow spots he is now infamously attached to was reportedly designed to embarrass the son of a plumber. And this was just sad, because had Vince given Dusty a bigger main event push, he could have been a huge star for the World Wrestling Federation, just as big of a star as he'd been down south. And we say that with confidence because, even with that material he was given to work with, Rhodes still managed to get over anyway as a very popular upper mid-card act all the way up until he eventually returned to WCW in 1991. In the end though, this was just another case of McMahon wanting to show that his company was the top wrestling federation and that anyone who came from elsewhere just wasn't on the same level. What a shame this was then, as we would have loved to see Dusty Rhodes as the true star he could have been by mixing it up with people like Hulk Hogan and the Ultimate Warrior. We would have loved to seen him win the WWF title, even if just for a short spell. But sadly, this just wasn't in the cards. And that same curse of being a former WCW guy would also lead to our next subject struggling when they jumped to WWF in 2001. Everyone's favorite beacon of positivity, Diamond Dallas Page. Now, if you were a fan of World Championship Wrestling during the Monday Night Wars, then it might seem impossible to think that there was any situation where DDP could fail to get over. After all, we are talking about one of the most naturally likable babyfaces of his era. But despite becoming a huge breakout star down in Atlanta at the turn of the millennium, a big enough star to win the WCW World Heavyweight title on 3 separate occasions, mind you, once the company went out of business in 2001 and Diamond Dallas Page made the jump over to the WWF, things ended up not going so well. No, rather than being treated like a superstar on the level of a Stone Cold or The Rock, Page was instead cast as a creepy stalker of The Undertaker's then wife, Sarah. And this immediately pegged him in the eyes of the fans as someone who was not to be taken seriously. Needless to say, his future in WWE following that feud was not great, as he never really do much of note at all. Hell, we never even got that long-anticipated People's Champion versus People's Champion bout against the Great One. Could things have been different for the New Jersey native? Of course they could have. This is DDP we're talking about here, not some random jobber. No, in a just world, Page would have been a main event level draw for Vince McMahon for a few years yet as the new millennium arrived. But because he had the gall to be an ex-WCW guy, this was not something which was ever going to happen for him. So instead, he'd have to settle for a lone WrestleMania undercard match against Christian and then retirement from the WWE later that year. Still though, it could have been worse because at least Diamond Dallas Page got that one WrestleMania match to add to his list of accomplishments. And he was able to say he was a former multi-time world champion regardless of how things went in WWF. It's just a shame then that the same could not be said for our next subject, the enigma known as Kaval. Now, if the name Kaval doesn't ring any bells with you, then maybe another one will. Low Key. That's right, this is the indie moniker associated with this hard kicker from Brooklyn back when he was working with the likes of Ring of Honor, Pro Wrestling Guerrilla, and TNA. Sadly though, it's also a name which has a lot of baggage around it today. Why is that? Well, over the years, Low Key would build a reputation for himself as being difficult to work with. And this reputation always made it so Low Key felt like it was impossible for him to get to WWE one day. But then something interesting happened. In 2010, the New Yorker got a shot in Vince McMahon's promotion when he was brought in as a cast member of Season 2 in NXT back when the brand was still in its original game show format. How would the newly renamed Kaval do in NXT? Pretty good, all things considered. In fact, by the time all was said and done, he'd go on to win the whole thing. And this led to him getting a run on the main roster where his main gimmick going forward would be that he'd be the minion of sorts for Lay Cool. As you would expect then, this was not a role Kaval was particularly happy to play, and he wasn't shy about making this known. So it was then that in record time he managed to piss off everyone backstage, and after only a month on the SmackDown roster, he'd be cut from his contract. And once he was released, he would never again return to WWE. Could he have been used better? Sure, but in WWE's defense here, this was reportedly not a problem with their end and more of a problem with his. But what about a more modern day example of a misused superstar? Well, for that, we need to look at our next subject, Finn Balor. Yes, we know Finn Balor hasn't exactly had a terrible run in WWE. No, he's always had a pretty decent upper mid-card role. But he just could have done so much more. And if you need any evidence of why this is, just go back and watch some of his work in New Japan during the late 2000s and early 2010s. After all, it was there that he became one of the top acts in the promotion's junior heavyweight division, and it was also there that he formed the Bullet Club, one of the biggest wrestling stables in recent memory. So when he signed on the dotted line with WWE in 2014, it felt like the promotion had a surefire main event level superstar on their hands. And it seemed like they were aware of this, as throughout his run in NXT, the Irishman would be treated as such, with him becoming a multiple-time world champion on the developmental brand before it was all said and done. Hell, even when he moved up to the main roster in the summer of 2016, there was an initial big push given to him, so much so that mere weeks after his debut, he'd be beating Seth Rollins to become the inaugural Universal Champion. But that's where the problems began, because it was during this match that a botched buckle bomb caused Balor to suffer a separated shoulder, with this forcing him to relinquish his newly won title the very next night on Raw. But at least he'd bounce back from that upon his return from injury, right? Well, no, because once he was ring ready again, things would not be the same for Balor. No, by that point, Vince McMahon had already moved on from him. So while Finn would always have a role on the show going forward, it would never be as prominent of a role as it should have been. Really, if this was a just world, we'd be sitting here today talking about the former Prince Devitt as one of the top acts in WWE and a multi-time WWE champion. But that's not the way things have gone for him. No, even after Triple H took over the book in 2022, Balor would remain a mostly tag team wrestler in the Judgment Day. And given that he's now 42 years old, it doesn't look like that will be changing anytime soon. So with that in mind, let's move over to our next subject instead. Another mid-2010s NXT talent who got misused on the WWE main roster, the one and only Shinsuke Nakamura. Yes, one of the greatest wrestlers of the 2000s and 2010s, Shinsuke Nakamura first made a major name for himself back when he was a part of the New Japan roster, as it was there he was able to become a 3-time IWGP Heavyweight Champion and 5-time IWGP Intercontinental Champion, all while having some of the best matches of his era. So good was he, in fact, that by the time 2016 came around, he had no more worlds left to conquer in Japan, and this is what led him to jump over to WWE instead. Needless to say then, when it was announced that the King of Strong Style was going to be arriving in WWE, excitement was at a fever pitch, with everyone hoping that they were going to see something truly special at this point. Alas though, that one initial match in NXT against Sami Zayn aside, this was just not the way things played out, and instead we have a situation where in 2025, Nakamura is nothing more than a mid-card act. Things just never quite clicked with Shinsuke and the fans for one reason or another. Yes, he did do great in NXT, and he did look good winning the Royal Rumble in 2018, but after having a disappointing match with AJ Styles at WrestleMania that year, things were just never quite the same for Nakamura in WWE. But let's move away from Shinsuke for now, and back in time to the Ruthless Aggression era. Yes, it's time for us to talk about Shelton Benjamin. Sure, you could argue Shelton Benjamin never had the same levels of charisma as someone like a Shinsuke Nakamura, but what he lacked in that, he made up for in pure wrestling skill. In fact, back during the 2000s when he was first part of the WWE roster, you could argue he was among the best workers they had. And considering this was a roster which included names like Kurt Angle, Eddie Guerrero, and Shawn Michaels, that's certainly saying something. However, despite this great in-ring work, he was never able to make it beyond the mid-card level in WWE. Why was that? Well, even when Vince did make a push to elevate Shelton, it always felt half-hearted, with there being a lot of stop-start attempts in getting him to that next level. By the time the late 2000s came around, he was pretty much casted as a mid-carder for life. So much so that even when he left WWE and returned in 2017, he'd still find himself in the exact same role as a mid-card act. And ever since leaving WWE in 2023, he has been making big business moves over in AEW. And Shelton Benjamin certainly isn't the only person who wrestled for All Elite Wrestling following a run in WWE. No, if we look at our next subject, we'll find another example of this in action. Who are we talking about here? Why, the man called Sting, of course. Yes, if WWE was led by the babyface theatrics of John Cena, and ECW found a beating heart in Tommy Dreamer, then for World Championship Wrestling back during the late 80s and 90s, that role was filled by Steve Borden. So much of a WCW guy was Sting, in fact, that even when the company went out of business in 2001, he neglected to sign with WWE, with him instead hitching his wagon to the then upstart TNA promotion. But like so many others before him, the Californian eventually found himself in WWE anyways. But when he finally arrived, it did not lead to a satisfying run at all. What happened here? Well, after a monumental debut where he helped Dolph Ziggler to put a temporary end to the Authority, Sting would quickly fall into a WrestleMania feud with Triple H and not, as everyone wanted, The Undertaker. And this feud would ultimately center around another WWE and WCW battle. And that meant rather than Sting come out victorious in his lone WrestleMania match, he'd instead eat the pin as the game once more represented the victory of WWE. But at least the 6-time WCW World Heavyweight Champion could salvage things after this, right? Well, unfortunately no, as not long after this, Borden would suffer an injury during a botched buckle bomb which ended his career for a few years, with this meaning he would never again wrestle inside a WWE ring. No, when Sting did eventually get his true retirement run later on during the 2020s, it would happen in AEW instead. But let's move away from this legend of the 90s for now and on to someone who rose to prominence during the 2000s instead. Someone like our next subject, Dolph Ziggler. That's right, Dolph Ziggler was criminally underutilized during his WWE tenure between 2004 and 2023. Hell, there were various points throughout his nearly 2-decade-long career there that he could have very easily been a top-level main event guy. But for one reason or another, Vince McMahon never chose to go all in on the show-off. No, while he would give him a bit of a push at points, even making him World Heavyweight Champion on 2 separate occasions, these pushes were never sustained, and it always felt like right as the Cleveland native was starting to build up some momentum, he'd quickly be pulled back down to earth again. What a crime this is then, because in Ziggler you had, during his peak years at least, someone who felt very much like a modern day incarnation of Curt Hennig, a wrestler who could always be relied upon to have a great match no matter who he was put up against. And this was something that was evident anytime he set foot in the ring. Come on now, take that Money in the Bank cash-in that he was a part of on the Raw after WrestleMania 29. One of the greatest cash-ins ever, right up there alongside Seth Rollins at WrestleMania 31 and the original Edge one. That was a star-making moment if there ever was one. And so, once it was over, the former Spirit Squad member should have been a made man in WWE for the rest of his days. But this was not what happened, and instead Dolph would do what he always did, fall back down into the mid-card, with this being where he remained right up until the point of his release in September of 2023. Still, at least the man now going by his real name of Nick Nemeth has continued to work in places like TNA and New Japan post WWE, so it's not like he's done in the ring quite yet. One person who most certainly has hung his boots by this point though would be our next subject, another person whose run in WWE was completely botched, the human suplex machine, Taz. Now if you were a fan of ECW during the mid to late 90s, then you'll remember that, back then, there were few people more intimidating than Taz. And the reason for this was because his character was essentially a prototype version of what people like Brock Lesnar would later portray. An aggressive quasi-shoot fighter who dismantled his opponents with a series of well-timed attacks. Usually for him, this meant suplexes specifically. If you got caught up in this wave of moves, it meant your days were numbered. So how could things possibly go wrong for Taz once he made his jump over to WWE in 2000? After all, with a guy who was as over as Taz was, especially to that Madison Square Garden crowd during his debut at the Royal Rumble, it should have been an obvious choice to push him to the moon. Well, according to the former 2-time ECW World Heavyweight Champion, it was this very moment which sealed his fate. Yes, he believed that getting over on his own merits without any input from Vince McMahon was enough to cause his new boss to sour on him, as Vince notoriously didn't like to push anything he didn't create. And if this was the reason, then it would explain why, almost immediately after his excellent debut, Taz found himself falling down the card to the point that, come that summer, he'd be in a feud with commentator Jerry Lawler. Then there was that infamous entry in the 2001 Rumble where, 1 year after he made such a great initial impact, the human suplex machine would be treated like a jobber when he was eliminated by Kane after just 10 seconds in the ring. Yes, only 12 months into his WWF run, and it was clear Peter Sinetrio was being wasted. And Taz isn't the only ECW alumni to never make it in WWE, as the same thing could be said about our next subject, Dean Douglas. This was the man who became the franchise of Extreme Championship Wrestling back during the mid-90s. How did he do this? Well, by literally being the one to throw the NWA World's title to the ground and proclaiming himself as the new ECW World Champion. As you would expect then, this turned Douglas into something of a hero for fans at the legendary 2300 Arena. And it meant that he'd be able to rise all the way to the top of the mountain on 4 separate occasions during his tenure there as World Champion of ECW. Sadly though, this did not mean Shane would make a lot of money. No, if there was one notorious negative about ECW, it was that Paul Heyman wasn't known to be paying people well, if at all. So that's why, in 1995, Douglas decided to sign on the dotted line with WWF instead, with him soon being rebranded there as Dean Douglas, an evil teacher. Why a teacher? Well, in his life prior to pro wrestling, Douglas was an actual teacher, and when Vince McMahon heard about that, he thought it would make for a perfect gimmick for the cartoon character era that was the new generation. Unfortunately though, while the boss was all in on this gimmick initially, it didn't lead to much success for Dean in WWE. No, pretty quickly, he'd fall into the firing line of the Clique. And because the Clique took a dislike to him, it meant Douglas's career was over in WWF before it even started, as the crew pretty much ran the show back then. Even though he was a clear star, nothing ever really came of the franchise's spell under Vince McMahon's employ. And that would lead to him being gone from the company by January 1st of 1996, with him never returning again thereafter. One person who did get a longer run in WWE, however, would be our next subject. That said, they'd also be someone who was misused in many ways. Who are we talking about this time? Well, it's the Big Show. Yes, we know it might seem wild to call Big Show someone who was misused in WWE. After all, this is a guy who had a very long and successful career there. Not only is he a multiple-time world champion, but the man also main evented WrestleMania in 2000. But while these are all great accomplishments, there's still that sense that Paul White could have been so much more if he was booked differently. And the reason we say that is because there are just so few legitimate giants in wrestling. No, while big men are common, a bona fide 7-footer is a rarity, especially one who could go in the ring to a surprising level like Big Show could during his early days. Really, in a different timeline, we could be talking about the South Carolinian today as the turn of the millennium version of Andre the Giant. But sadly, that's not what happened, as rather than become the ultimate attraction, someone who could appear sparingly and always make an impact whenever they did, White happened to come around during the era of weekly live TV, and this meant he'd be overexposed very quickly. Needless to say then, this drained away much of his aura and left him feeling like just another guy on the roster. Sure, it didn't help that he was often put in the mid-card where he'd be losing to the likes of pre-main event Jeff Hardy. But even if he had been continuing to feud with the Steve Austins of the world at the top of the card, this was still probably going to be the Giant's fate anyways. Yes, the curse of being on TV every week is that, after a while, you're just not gonna feel special anymore. And this was most certainly a sad fate which fell upon Paul White. Yes, even though he is a legend, there's always this sense that he could have been more, just like everyone else we looked at today.